Sister Miriam pushed the warped door and stopped when a candle-lit circle and a low chant filled the chamber. Suspicion tightened her hands around the codex at her hip. She had come to the manor to copy a single margin note, and instead found a body of initiates bent around a stitched chart. The chant cut off when a hand flashed a bronze pendant in the firelight. Alastair stood at the head of the circle, his voice low and measured. Miriam stepped fully into the doorway, the wooden jamb biting her shoulder, and the room's heat washed over her pages and ink. Suspicion is the emotion that pushed her back into the manor that night. It had settled over several small irregularities, missing folios, ledger entries reopened in odd hands, a parchment threaded with crimson that had not belonged to any known family. She kept her fingers pressed to the cloth binding of her codex and watched for proof. This was not voyeurism. This was verification. The first exchange arrived without a pause. Sister Miriam, Alastair staring at her with steel, grey eyes. You enter where you do not belong. His jaw was tight. His ring caught the candle flame. Miriam did not answer immediately. She forced her breath into even counts and stepped out of the doorway so the initiates could see her hands were empty. You should leave, Alastair added. Now. His tone carried the authority of a man used to decisions being obeyed. Miriam's throat tightened. She had smoothed other hands before inked pages, but she had never smoothed a lie. She held the codex like an altar. Alastair, she said, and the single word cut into the circle. Explain the stitch on the chart. The word landed. Two initiates shifted. Someone hissed a syllable and looked away. Alastair's expression narrowed. He did not answer with a sermon. He walked to the chained desk, tapped his signet ring, and called for the elders. That single motion changed the room's temperature from secret to accusation. 2 sentences later, a watcher slipped through the side door. Thomas Warden, breath quick, coat muddied from the courtyard, his fingers clamped around a torn pamphlet. He bowed his head to Miriam in a way that carried urgency rather than shame. Sister Miriam, he said in clipped bursts, you must see, there is a page. There is a name. He held out the pamphlet and produced a scrap of partial sigil as proof. Miriam took the scrap with a hand that trembled only slightly. The sigil's ink was old and salt-stained. The stitch on the chart in the chamber had been crimson thread woven around names. The pamphlet's ink matched the thread's faded dye. Thomas's arrival introduced new stakes. This was not a private rite. A fragment had escaped. Miriam felt her chest tighten with decisional pressure she could not soften with prayer. She followed Thomas away from the chamber into the walled courtyard, where the night air cut the candle's smoke from her lungs. He slammed the door shut and stood too close, breathing wet earth and damp wool. They marked it, he said. They named an ancestor. Alastair saw it was from the Grigori. If the ledger sealed that name, the house would be unquestionable. His sentences broke against each other. He was trying to give her a map of panic. Miriam looked at the pamphlet again. She felt doubt turn to dread and then reshape into determination. That was the first emotion shift, suspicion, dread, resolve. Show me the name. Her voice was quiet, measured. Thomas turned the torn page. A single worn line of embroidery in the pamphlet matched a place on the crimson chart. The name was an old one, a syllable that could be pronounced as honor or heresy depending on who read it. They moved through the manor in silence. Miriam's boots sounded hollow on stone. The narrative tone here is spare and forensic. The narrator will record what Miriam did rather than supply introspective justifications. She guided Thomas to the scriptorium behind the kitchens, a low room with a slit window that let in dawn light enough to read by. She set the cloth, bound codex on the table and undid its seals. The codex yielded the family tree. A fold of stitched vellum, names connected by crimson thread and annotated with cipher marks in Sister Miriam's neat hand from years of patient copying. Under the red stitch someone had driven a small, jagged run of ink. A claimed Grigori ancestor spelled out with circuitous notation and a marginal sigil. For Miriam, the discovery was the pivot. The society had moved from claim to recorded lineage. "This is not a symbol to hang in a doorway," Thomas whispered. "They want the ledger to hold authority." He tugged at the cord around his wrist, and could not stop his hands from trembling. Miriam felt the second emotion shift: resolve, fear, cautious strategy. She tapped the part of the tree that linked the name to the main line with a forefinger smudged in ink. Miriam began to work. She read the cipher marks, unthreaded a mnemonic that Sister Miriam had helped craft years before, and reference signatures she remembered from parish records. She murmured aloud when she worked. This stitch was added in hand 2, not 1. Her voice was factual. It drew Alistair's authority into question. Someone altered lineage for advantage. The room did not fill with moralizing. It filled with specific accusation and evidence. Alistair's summons came quickly after. He called a private council in the great hall before dawn. The great hall smelled of boiled cabbage and old wood polish. A brazier's glow kept the shadows tight against the rafters. Alistair entered with elders at his shoulder. He raised the ledger and tapped it with the ledger chain. "A breach has been found," he said. "All pockets searched. None shall leave until we decide." The sentence made motion. The hall's doors closed. Miriam stood with Thomas near the back bench. She kept her posture straight though her hands were numb. She watched Alistair as he flexed his power. He did not shout, he did not rattle scripture. He cited lineage, duty, and the sanctity of the house. His voice was calm, but it carried the threat of institutional machinery. Miriam nothing at first. She let the elders speak and name consequences. An elder named Hargrove stepped forward with a ledger sheet and read aloud a passage that made the room narrower. "A name, once sealed here, binds the household and its heirs," he said. "To alter that is treason against our charge." Hargrove's voice was blunt. His eyes rested on Miriam and Thomas like weights. The accusation now had legal texture. Alistair did not immediately order punishment. Instead, he ordered a private verification and summoned Miriam to the chained desk. "Sister Miriam," he said, and the name carried the same weight as a summons to confession. "You will duplicate the stitch on the ledger in my presence and verify the record." There was no plea. There was a command that required her hands. Miriam felt her options narrow to 2 stark acts: comply and seal a false heritage, or refuse and invite immediate retribution on herself and Thomas. The emotional mechanics were concrete. Clenched jaw, the dry taste at the back of her throat, the tightening of her fingers around the codex. She one question that functioned as a tactical buy. "May I have a candle and the cord?" Alistair nodded. He wanted the ritual to be legible and public. He wanted a witness to the verification. The private antechamber smelled of cold stone and iron. A chained desk sat beneath a narrow window. The ledger lay open, pages sewn and heavy. Alistair watched with folded hands. Thomas stood slightly behind Miriam, his shoulders hunched, his eyes scanning the door as if measuring the time before someone could appear. "Miriam, Alistair, you understand what is required. Make the stitch as you have been taught. Confirm lineage." His voice contained the social mechanism that would silence challenge. Miriam sat. The ledger's weight made the desk groan when she leaned forward. She uncapped her ink with a thumb that did not tremble outwardly. The needle felt cold. This was the chapter's climax. Forced marking of the ledger, the precise moment where a single stitch decided an heir. She began to duplicate the crimson stitch. Her hand moved with the slow certainty of someone who had learned to stitch names into cloth for years, who had memorized the pressure of thread that would hold. The room narrowed to the arc of the needle and the soft scratch of quill on vellum. Alistair watched every motion, tapping his ring whenever he thought she might hesitate. Thomas's breath came in small, irregular bursts. Miriam paused over a node in the family tree where the name would be attached. She could feel the ledger's chain against her knee. She could feel the candle flame reflect in Alistair's signet ring. Her decision condensed into a single hand movement. She could stitch the name cleanly and seal the claimed Grigori ancestor into the household record. Or she could alter the line and place a different name, or a break that would spare one life. She tasted metal at the back of her mouth. In the channel of tension, she made another choice. She deliberately slowed and altered the stitch, diverting the thread into a marginal knot and embedding a tiny cipher only she and the codex could resolve. The ledger would still bear a crimson thread, but its shape would mask the exact link Alistair sought. That was the third emotion shift. Fear, cunning, commitment. Miriam did not speak as she worked. Her breathing paced the needle. Alistair leaned forward. "What is that?" he said. His sound was a measured cut. Miriam did not look up. She finished the knot, smoothed the thread, and forced a neutral tone. "It is a common variant," she said, a scribal practice adding redundancy to hair marks. Her voice made the ledger seem technical rather than treacherous. Alistair's jaw clenched, but he accepted the answer for the moment. He ordered the elders to inspect the stitch and sealed the ledger with wax. The elders hovered, eyes seeking a flaw. Thomas kept his hands balled at his side. Miriam felt the ledger warm beneath her palm once sealed, as if the paper had absorbed heat from living hands. Afterward, Miriam retreated to a servant passage. She paused in a narrow stairwell and undid a folded folio she had carried hidden beneath her robe. She slipped a falsified folio into Thomas's pack when he came to a prearranged post by the back stairs, small knots in his voice when he asked, "Do you trust this will hold?" She touched his sleeve with a quick, sure motion and said, "God willing, it will lead them away." Her action forced Thomas into motion. Thomas adjusted his pack and left the manor at first light, the torn pamphlet now replaced by a convincing forgery. He walked through the walled yard and did not look back. The choice to send him away was concrete. A door closed behind him, a gate latched, footsteps in gravel heading toward the village. Miriam watched until the courtyard gates swallowed his coat. She returned to the ledger room to face Alistair and the elders. Her palms left a faint smear of ink on the ledger edge. Alistair watched her reappear with a look that mixed triumph with suspicion. He had lost the immediate certainty that the recorded line would be his unquestioned proof, but he still held the social machinery. The elders, the sealed book, the oath. The ledger now bore a new, ambiguous thread. In the final motion, the narrator records the epilogue without sentimentalizing. Miriam sat once more at the chained desk and catalogued the cipher she had woven into the stitch. Precise needle counts, a marginal flourish only she would recall, a cipher mark under the leather. She noted its place in her codex with care. Then she closed the codex and returned it to a hidden pocket soon beneath her gown. Her handwriting left no flourish. It left practical indexing for later verification. The narrator observed the ledger and wrote the last recorded note that night. The ledger's line had been altered, and a copy had left the manor. The change did not resolve the larger danger. It only shifted who possessed proof. The altered lineage would haunt those who protected it, and those who betrayed it. Outside, Thomas's footsteps died into the village. Inside, Alistair convened watch rotations and ordered a narrow search for extraneous folios. Miriam stayed and answered questions like a woman who had done what duty required, while also holding a secret no one else could read. Her hands smelled of ink and beeswax and something metallic that came from the needle's point. An unexpected twist arrived in the next hour. An elder named Hargrove produced a ledger sheet whose ink matched not only the crimson stitch, but a long, buried parish register that named an obscure midwife as a common ancestor to both the manor's line and a family in the next county. Hargrove read the passage aloud and then looked at Alistair. "This presence in the register predates your claim, Alistair," he said. "If proven, it undermines the exclusivity you asserted." The room shifted. That reveal changed how everyone understood earlier entries and forced Alistair to cover his explication with administrative measures rather than theological ones. Miriam felt a small relief at the twist, but she did not smile. The ledger's knot still sat beneath her palm, secretive as a Soon token. Thomas's departure had bought hours and perhaps days. The immediate confrontation had been resolved. The social machinery remained, and Alastair could marshal laws, marriages, and pacts. The chapter's conflict ended with action. The ledger sealed, a copy hidden outside, and a parish register introduced as counter-evidence. The narrator notes the emotional state without grand claim. Miriam's hands were steady when she catalogued the cipher. She moved as someone trained to preserve records under fire. Thomas walked away with a falsified folio in his pack and a new route to safety. Alastair remained with authority, his power flexed but not absolute. Hargrove's register forced the issue into paperwork rather than public confession. A final concrete beat closes the chapter. After the elders dispersed and the great hall's candles guttered, a single knock echoed at the outer gate. Miriam went to the narrow slit window and watched a mud-streaked form pause in the yard. The gate opened. A courier from the county handed a sealed letter to the manor guard. It bore the county seal and a summons for Alastair's presence before a magistrate to verify lineage claims. The summons would complicate Alastair's control. Miriam folded her hands and watched the guard carry the letter inside. She did not move to touch it. She had placed a different kind of proof in Thomas's pack and a cipher not in the ledger. And now an external legal summons would force the society to answer where secrets preferred to remain quiet. The narrator ends the chapter with what is concrete. The ledger bears a new, ambiguous thread. Thomas leaves with a falsified copy. A county summons arrives to complicate Alastair's authority. The immediate, violent rupture has been avoided. The consequences have been set in motion. In the following minutes, Miriam recorded the cipher into her codex with precise strokes, locked it beneath the lining of her gown, and returned to the chained desk to relight a candle as if to continue her work. She sat with the ledger before dawn and let the detail of stitches and ink hold the story for her. The night was not closed, and decisions would still be demanded. But for now the chapter resolves in action. A forged folio leaves the manor, a secret stitch is placed, a summons will arrive. The ledger's altered line will move the story and determine who next will reach for the needle. Thomas slammed the pamphlet down so hard the wooden table jumped. "They will bind him tonight," he snarled. Fear pushed Sister Miriam out of her chair before she had time to name it. She leaned forward and pressed both hands to the table. Rain hissed against the tavern window and smeared the candlelight into wet streaks. In those wet streaks the torn sigil on the pamphlet looked like a broken star. Who will they bind? Sister Miriam, keeping her voice low so the other patrons would not look up. The question was practical. It demanded names and places. Her fingers found the quill behind her ear, an automatic gesture that steadied her hands. Thomas did not hesitate. Their ledger names a bloodline, everyone. The rite tonight, it's to consecrate the chosen heir. It's at Crow Manor. His words hit like a stone. He pushed a corner of the pamphlet across to her so she could read the scrawled sentence. Consecrate the heir at midnight. Sister Miriam's mouth tightened. She remembered the warped door from the last ledger entry where a candle, lit circle and a low chant filled the chamber. That night she had watched the circle from the threshold and felt the ledger's weight in her hands. The memory of that chant settled into a dull ache behind her ribs and made her throat work. She counted the syllables on the pamphlet with her eyes. A list of names, a place, a single hour. The needle of fear in her chest changed shape into a practical calculation. We leave now." Thomas rose so quickly he knocked his chair backward. They left the tavern together. The rain slapped their cloaks. Thomas kept glancing over his shoulder as if someone might appear on the road and rid the torn sigil for what it was. They reached Sister Miriam's scriptorium in under an hour. She unlocked the heavy wooden chest chained to the table and set the crimson ledger beside the torn pamphlet. The ledger had been opened to a ciphered passage when she had last closed it. Her hands were steady when she spread sheets on the table. She sat with the ledger like a surgeon at an instrument table. Her skin prickled under the candlelight, but she forced herself to focus on letters and not on the sensation. The emotion root, fear, sat behind every choice she made now. It was the reason she had left the tavern and the reason she would risk what came next. Thomas paced the room. The heiress name is stitched into a family tree, he said. They used crimson thread. His voice hitched on the last word, and he rubbed the knotted cord at his wrist with a thumb. The gesture betrayed an attempt to steady himself. Sister Miriam unrolled the ledger's margin notes. She traced the cipher marks with an iron bracelet finger until the shapes resolved. She read aloud short sections, then stopped to decode. She spoke in clipped sentences that left no room for speculation. This passage ties the right to a lineage, she said. It ties it to a child born in the year of the comet. Her voice did not tremble, but she paused between clauses to breathe. Thomas stopped pacing and listened. They worked in the scriptorium while the manor lay 2 roads away under the same rain. The candles threw hard shadows against the stacks of paper. The ledger smelled of beeswax and old ink, which Sister Miriam allowed to remind herself of facts rather than fear. They found the annotated family tree folded into a folio beneath the ledger. The stitching was indeed crimson. Sister Miriam's fingers slipped into a small knot and tugged until the thread gave. The name beneath the thread had been hidden with a hand that meant secrecy. Sister Miriam read the name and did not speak at first. Thomas's face changed color under the candlelight. Tell me." The silence stretched long enough that the rain sounded louder. She lifted her head and said the name slowly, Thomas Warden. The 3 words landed in the scriptorium like a verdict. Thomas took a step back as if struck me. He sounded both incredulous and afraid. His hands went to his throat as if to make sure his pulse stayed where he could find it. Sister Miriam watched him. She smoothed her hands as she always did before writing, an action that had nothing to do with ritual and everything to do with control. "The ledger implies you are the bloodline the society intends to bind," she said. A rapid argument began between them then, short lines fired in quick succession because there was no time for clarity.
"I never knew!"
"Thomas, I left the man who raised me. I didn't. Alistair would chain you to a duty you never asked for." Sister Miriam interrupted. "Alistair Crow will say lineage is a right. He will claim obligation." Her words were measured and direct. Each one aimed to cut through denial. "Alistair Crow." Thomas' voice rose. "You mean that man who walks like he owns every room he enters? He spat the name in anger. He can do this to me. He can take my life for some promise no one asked me to keep." His jaw worked. Sister Miriam leaned forward and placed a hand on the ledger. "Thomas," she said, "this isn't his alone. The ledger shows ritual, witnesses, and a method. They will call it consecration. They will call it salvation." She let the last word drop and then looked away. The argument became a negotiation. Thomas wanted escape. Sister Miriam wanted proof smuggled outside. They traded quick plans. The practical moves they suggested were small. A forged notice, a false alibi, a burned name. Each plan required time they did not have. Footsteps on the landing interrupted them. The scriptorium door opened and Alistair Crow filled the corridor with his presence. He wore the dark cloak with faded gold thread. He did not knock. He did not smile. "Thomas." Alistair sharply when he saw him. "You are late." The accusation tasted like more than punctuality. He stepped into the room and shut the door behind him. "Thomas swallowed, Alistair," he said. His voice tried to hold calm and failed. He kept glancing at the ledger as if it might leap up and speak. Alistair's face hardened. He tapped the signet ring along his left hand as if measuring the air. "You would betray us?" he asked. The room became a small council. Alistair demanded answers. Thomas offered a halting confession. Sister Miriam read aloud the ledger passages that named date, ceremony, and obligations. Each sentence she spoke shortened the space between accusation and verdict. The debate moved like a blade through trust. Alistair argued lineage and duty. We keep the line, because the knowledge must remain in blood, he said. The Grigori taught certain rites. We guard what they left. His voice was low and persuasive, not raised but heavy enough to make the walls listen. Thomas struck back in bursts. I never gave consent, he said. You cannot bind me because of a name sewn into cloth. He stepped toward Alistair and stopped 2 paces away. Alistair's eyes narrowed. Consent is not the point, Thomas. Continuity is. He tapped his ledger, a small, chained book, and let the word continuity hang there like a charge. Behind that single word sat a host of obligations and threats he did not need to name. Sister Miriam watched their faces closely. She noted Alistair's scar, the mother of pearl shard in the signet, the way he always tilted his head when considering scripture. She also noted Thomas' hands, collused and quick, and the way he refused eye contact when spoken to about his past. The room split into positions. One side argued for the ritual's necessity, the other for escape or sabotage. Voices rose in short, clipped bursts. In the middle of the clash, Sister Miriam found a cipher thread in the ledger margin she had not seen before. She tugged the thread and let the folio fall open on the table so everyone could see. The inked name had an annotation. Candidate must be bound before first crowing if born in comet year. Alistair's jaw tightened. Thomas heard the line and made a decision the way a man makes a physical movement. I will not be taken at dawn, he said. I will run. He moved toward the window as if to test the rain's direction. Alistair stepped between him and the door. You will not run, he said. There are witnesses and oaths. You will stay for the consecration, or you will leave the world remembering Alistair Crow's mercy. The quiet of that threat made everyone stop speaking for a long beat. 3 acolytes appeared then in the corridor, as if summoned by the threat. They were cloaked in the same dark cloth as Alistair and carried ropes and iron clasps. They did not speak. They only waited for instruction. Thomas lunged for the back door. He aimed for a gap between 2 of the acolytes and pushed through. Rain met him outside and stripped the damp from his hair. He sprinted toward the courtyard. Alistair signaled without raising his voice, a single hand movement. The acolytes moved like trained hounds. They flowed down the corridor and out into the night. Sister Miriam heard the soft, fast steps of many feet on wet stone. Sister Miriam ran to the window and watched Thomas cross the courtyard. He moved past a row of broken statues and toward the gate. He looked smaller in the open air. In that instant she saw a figure detach from the line of acolytes and cut him off at the arch. The courtyard fight was short and brutal. Thomas swung his arms and knocked an acolyte back. He managed to throw the first clasp, but the second man wrapped a rope around Thomas' wrists and pulled him down. The sound of rending fabric and a grunt landed hard in the night. Acolytes bound Thomas' hands and lifted him. He kicked and spat. Miriam! He shouted. The name was a summons and a plea. It carried through the rain to the scriptorium window. Inside, Sister Miriam ripped a folio from the ledger with 2 quick movements. Her fingers left a smear of beeswax on the margin. She folded the paper and ran toward the library alcove where a narrow vent led outward. Alistair watched her with an expression that mixed calculation and something like pity. You will not ruin what we have preserved, he said. You owe this to the line. He spoke in the measured cadence that had kept men obedient in many rooms. Sister Miriam did not answer. She moved her shoulders, smoothed her gown, and slid the ciphered folio beneath the fabric of her dress. The move was a practical concealment, an action that would matter later if anyone searched her body. Outside, an acolyte struck Thomas with the flat of his hand to keep him still. He hissed and then fell into a silence that was raw and human. The acolytes tied his wrists to a post with rough rope and left him upright like a pleading figure. Thomas's breathing came in short, wet bursts. He kept blinking as if the rain stung his eyes. A smear of mud streaked his cheek where he had hit stone. He watched the manor door as if it might open and release mercy. Sister Miriam worked quickly in the library alcove. She considered two options and chose both in sequence: destroy and smuggle. She burned a single page that contained a list of witnesses, and ashes caught on the hearth like black feathers. She then folded the ciphered folio into a small packet and wrapped it in waxed cloth. Her hands trembled slightly, but not from doubt alone. Her trembling came from the calculus of consequences, what the ledger revealed, and what Alistair would do if the folio left the manor. Fear had shifted into a colder resolve. That was the first emotion shift, fear-resolve. She prepared a second motion. She wrote a short anonymous note with instructions to a contact in the nearby market and sealed it with a wax drop. She planned to slide the note into the hand of a vendor who passed the manor each morning. The plan required the vendor to be willing, and the vendor to live long enough to deliver the message. Sister Miriam wrapped the packet in cloth and slid it into a hollow in the alcove meant for a long, buried book. She closed the bookcase and set a small terracotta figurine in front of the seam. The figurine had a chipped wing that fit the ledger's fractured angelic motif. Then a sound came from beyond the library wall, a low chant starting in the courtyard and building quickly into multiple voices. The cadence was the chant she had heard the night she had first pushed the warped door and stopped when the candle-lit circle filled the chamber. The memory from Chapter 1 arrived in precise sensory detail. Cracked timber, the smell of burnt beeswax, the scraping of a quill. She felt the earlier night slip into the present in terms of things she could touch and hold. Sister Miriam put her ear to the keyhole and listened. The chant listed names in a ledger cadence and called out a phrase that marked ritual commencement. She swallowed, tasting salt and smoke. The room felt smaller in a factual way. A ledger on a table, a locked chest, a single window. Her options narrowed. She could either let the ritual happen and live with the guilt, or she could try to stop it and risk everything. The second emotion shift occurred then. Resolve doubt. She felt the practical fear of consequences pull at her resolve. She moved toward the door and then away. She smoothed her hands the way she always did, an action that functioned like counting stitches. She thought of the ledger's annotation and of Thomas' expression when she had said his name aloud. The ledger's inked line had changed the room's physics. People were now choices to be made, not abstractions. At the corridor threshold she paused and then made a decision that was neither wholly brave nor purely cowardly. She would not stand and watch another binding. She would not take Thomas' place in a sacrament she did not authorize. She would create proof and deliver it outside the manor. She opened the door and walked into the corridor where Alistair and two acolytes stood waiting, as if to prove her movement had been expected. Alistair's voice was soft, but it cut. "Miriam," he said, "you have a ledger. You will not make this public." He stepped forward and touched the ledger with a single finger, as if to test its reality. "I will not let you bind a man who never consented, Sister Miriam." Her tone was controlled, but it quivered at the edges. She could feel the ledger's paper press against her hip through the folds of her gown. That contact grounded her. Alistair circled her like a cat that knows the floor plan of a room. "We do not bind men to their own fears," he said. "We bind them to what keeps our knowledge alive." He held her gaze long enough for the line to function as both argument and threat. The acolytes closed ranks. One of them reached for her sleeve. She pulled her arm back with a small, precise motion and then pivoted. A push. The acolyte stumbled but did not fall. Outside, the chant moved into a crescendo. A bell struck somewhere in the manor as if to mark the hour. The courtyard doors opened and men carried a box to the center where Thomas had been bound. Someone threw a blanket over his shoulders. Sister Miriam ran, as she had run earlier for study, and as she had run when fear forced decisions. She moved through the service corridors and down the back steps toward the market lane, where her vendor contact sold dried herbs. She kept her shoulders low and did not look back. On the stairs she heard the quick steps of pursuit. Someone called her name. She did not stop. The packet burned slightly at the seam where a waxed edge had not fully sealed. She kept walking until the night swallowed her, and the market lamps opened like dull eyes. In the final paragraph, the narrator mapped immediate consequences. Thomas was bound in the courtyard and left tied to a post. The ledger lost, a folio burned, and a ciphered packet stolen. And the society closed ranks, convinced the rite would proceed. Sister Miriam found a vendor in the morning market and slid the waxed note into his palm, insisting he take no questions and no delays, and then returned to the manor to watch the gate from a shadowed lane as distant chanting rose again. Thomas slammed the scriptorium door with a sound like a struck plank and held up a torn page that smeared fresh blood across the parchment. Suspicion shaped every movement in the room. Sister Miriam's fingers tightened on the quill before she dropped it. "What is that?" she asked. Thomas shoved the ragged paper across the table. He spit a word between clenched teeth. They moved the date. The narrator recorded the action without flourish. A torn page, a new timetable, and the immediate danger that followed. Miriam bent close and traced the jagged ink with a fingertip. She smelled iron. She traced a name half formed in cipher. In the corner of the page, a looped character matched a mark she had seen the evening the warped door opened and chant filled a chamber. The night she first wrote in the crimson ledger. That concrete memory from the ledger night sat in her hands now. Candle wax pressed into the margin, the same cadence to the chant she had copied earlier. She looked at Thomas. "You, the pamphlet warned us. Miriam, you slammed it down in the tavern. Tell me plainly now." He nodded once, jaw working. The opening conflict was immediate. The ritual timetable had advanced, and the first act was a stolen page naming a local family. Miriam's background came into the room with her. She had kept ledgers for years, moving between parish scrivener work and secret codices chained beneath her bed. She kept the ledger folded within a cloth that still smelled of beeswax. Thomas had no ledger. He had a pamphlet he had nearly ripped in half out of panic a night earlier when he learned of a binding set to happen. "They will bind him tonight." He had bawled in the tavern, and that sentence had sent Miriam racing to lock her door. Now the same threat returned with a clear target, a named patriarch and a reference to a sealed chest in the manor archives. Thomas pushed a second scrap forward. "Read this," he said. "It names Aldwin. It points to the chest." His hand shook so that the candle flame jittered. Miriam raised both hands, smoothing them on the table in the way she always did before writing. Her mouth was a line. "Thomas, speak slowly. Where did you get this?" Thomas swallowed and forced words out in clip bursts outside the stables. "I found a courier injured on the lane. He had the page." He whispered Grigori, and then died. "I hid what I could." He kept looking at the shutters as if someone might watch through the cracked slats. Miriam's suspicion hardened into urgency. They worked quickly. Miriam spread her codex, wax seals breakable with a practiced thumb. The narrator noted the action. She opened to a page of genealogical ciphers and cross-referenced the partial name. Her eyes ticked along the index until she found a marginal note. A seal number matching the Manus archive registry. "Aldwin is listed under seal 6. Miriam, there's a chest there. It is chained, but I have seen the ledger notation for the key." She paused. "If they claim descent, the chest will list bloodlines and rites. If Aldwin is named, it makes the claim tangible." Thomas barked a laugh that sounded like a sob. "So we go tonight?" he asked. Miriam folded the torn page and tucked it into her sleeve. "We move quiet," she said. They left through a back passage that smelled of wet peat and horse sweat. The narrator described their movement with small, sharp sentences. Two shadows slipped beneath the eaves. A servant's lamp glowed within, boots softened by the mulch. Rain beat along the road in thin needles. Miriam kept her codex at her chest. Thomas kept his hand on the charm he refused to name. As they crept beneath the servant's stare at the manor, a lantern-bearer passed, his breath fogging a small cloud in the light. Thomas flattened against the stone, while Miriam flattened herself against the lintel and waited for the man's footsteps to fade. They reached the archive door, and Miriam's hands found the keyhole she had memorized from nights she had catalogued the manor's donations. She worked the ward with a pin lifted from her sleeve and wound the bolt until the chain slackened. The narrator recorded each sound. The click of tumblers, the scrape of iron on wood, the faint thud as the chained chest settled on stone. Inside they found star maps folded around angelic glyph, a stitched family tree with red thread still slick in places, and under the tree's folds, a ledger whose entries matched the fragment Thomas had produced. Thomas read aloud, voice jagged. Entry. Alduin marked witness, to be presented at first binding. His eyes darted to the tree. "I'm a witness," he said. Miriam's breath left her in a quick raspy. She ran a fingertip along the crimson thread. The stitch tied a name to a date and to a ritual note she had seen before in a margin. Claim of descent verified by third-hour rites. This names you as a witness, not as a blood heir, Miriam, but it lists an heir kept from public record. Thomas looked at her with a sudden, sharp fear. Who is the heir? At that moment the manor's archive door opened wider than it should. Footsteps stopped. A silhouette filled the doorway. Alistair Crow. He stepped forward with a measured gait that made the torchlight trace his cheekbones. He did not shout, he did not raise a hand. He simply set a ledger on the stone table and placed a bronze pendant beside it. "You are curious," he said, voice low and controlled. "Curiosity is dangerous at this hour." His eyes flicked to Thomas, then to Miriam. "Thomas Warden," he said. "You file the same name in your memory tonight." Thomas swallowed. His mouth made no sound. The confrontation shifted everything upward. Up to this point, suspicion had driven Miriam and urgency had driven Thomas. Now the emotion pivoted. Suspicion turned into fear when Alistair produced corroborating ledgers that matched the chest. Miriam felt her pulse rise so that her fingers tightened on the codex. She looked at Alistair and saw the patient certainty of a man who believed his paper to be proof enough of a sacred rite. "Alistair," Miriam, steadying herself on the table. "Why is Thomas named a witness?" He tapped the ledger with a ringed finger. "Because the lineage requires someone to attest. Because witnesses bind events into history. Because some doors open only when the proper hand presents the name." His tone held no threats, only assertion. Their emotional stakes shifted again as reasoning collided with raw survival. Alistair spread a small stack of pages. He did not scream or threaten. He produced evidence. The narrator recorded this as proof, not as sermon. "Here, Alistair, notes from the Grigori ledger. We preserved the names so the rite would carry. We kept the ledger sealed until the time a household required confirmation. The Alduin entry names a living heir. We reserve the right to present or withhold that name." Thomas' shoulders hunched. "Reserve? For what?" He asked. "For ceremony, Alistair, and for preservation of order. You carry the witness' roll, the heir." He let the word hang, and then closed the ledger with a soft smack. "Will be called when necessary." Miriam moved to cover the most damning pages with her hand. She had catalogued these pages before. She knew which entries would cause a claim to be enforced. Her action was quick and precise. "Alistair," she said, "not in the hallways, not tonight. You have no right to announce this in front of a witness. Let us leave with what we must and trust the chapters we keep." Alistair cocked his head. He produced a small, aged ledger chained to his belt. He tapped it. "Have kept pages hidden, Sister Miriam. You have made bargains with men of the tavern. You know how to keep records. You will not destroy what proves lineage, and you will not misrepresent it." He spoke the accusation plainly. Miriam's mouth tightened. She felt the ledger's revelation as a physical weight in her palms. A quick exchange followed, words sharp and compact. "Alistair, you trapped us. Thomas, you knew we'd decome." "I anticipated your movement," Alistair replied. "You underestimate my care for the house." Miriam cut in. "Alistair, name Alduin and we'll leave tonight with proof that the claim exists." Name him and we will expose what you call descent to the parish." Alastair tilted his head, then smiled in a way that was not a smile. "Expose? Do you believe the parish will accept a ledger? Do you believe the magistrate will read cipher and decide to sever lineage?" His voice did not rise. He simply laid out facts like cards. They argued for several minutes, three voices pressing at a single, brittle point. The dialogue turned practical. Thomas demanded protection. Miriam demanded names and a public record. Alastair maneuvered to keep control of the ledger. Rapid exchanges broke out. "Thomas, listen to me. Miriam, if we run with this, they will hunt you. If we publish it, they will burn the chest. Then keep it safe," Thomas snapped. "Hide it where no one looks. You do not hide what forms a line of descent." Alastair replied, "We preserve it for ritual and for authority." The argument tightened. Each demand increased the danger. Their emotions moved again. Urgency shifted toward bargaining and then toward a brittle compromise. Miriam made a choice with immediate consequences. She slid pages back into the chest, but kept several key folios beneath her gown. She spoke quietly. "Alastair, I'll give you part of the ledger's listing if you promise to spare Thomas the binding tonight, and to keep the ledger closed until dawn." Alastair studied her. "You promise?" He asked. "If you promise an oath with witnesses present." "Miriam, I will bind. But first, leave Thomas untouched at this hour." Alastair tapped his ring. He measured the bargain. "Very well. I accept a partial account. You will bind your partial account in my presence. Thomas will not be taken tonight. But the ledger remains under my guardianship." It was not a clean surrender. It was a contract that left them compromised. After Alastair stepped into the corridor to fetch the retainer who would witness the partial oath, Miriam exhaled through her teeth and counted the cost. She had concealed the folio that named the living heir. She kept it folded inside her codex. The narrator noted her movements without editorializing. She smoothed the paper, pressed wax to the fold, and wrapped the folio in a scrap of cloth. Thomas watched her with eyes raw. "Miriam," he said, voice thin, "why did you hide it?" She met his gaze. "Because if they know the heir, they will claim him. If they take the heir tonight, the binding begins. I could not hand them that power." He closed his mouth. His entire body carried the shock of being named. They retreated through servant passages, rain pulling runnels against the manor wall. A retainer shouted from a distance. Thomas bolted, dragging a hidden fragment in the lining of his coat. Miriam slowed to delay the retainer's notice, her back pressed along the cold stone as she signaled to Thomas with a tilt of her head. He slipped past, and they pushed into the yard where the rain mixed with the smell of churned earth. A lantern swung behind them as a retainer step neared, then faded. They crossed the cobbles and found a narrow safe room in a rented house Miriam had reserved for emergencies. Inside, she laid out the pages she had kept and catalogued them by wax seal and imprint. Dawn arrived as a thin grey slit in the shutters. Miriam lit a single candle and began to catalogue the folios, her movements efficient and mechanical. She labelled each with small, precise ink marks and noted the ritual dates scrawled in the margins. The narrator recorded a new emotional shift. Suspicion slowly resolved into grim resolve. Miriam's hands trembled when she placed the folio that named the heir on the table, but her voice did not. "We have one fragment that names a living heir," she said. "We can expose the ledger, but we must choose the time and the method. If we move now, we risk violence. If we wait, the date draws closer." Thomas ran his hand over the fragment without touching the ink. "Who is it?" he asked. Miriam would not say aloud the name. She only pointed to the notation and tapped the wax seal. The name would have weight if spoken. She kept it in reserve. They made a plan with concrete steps. Miriam would transcribe the fragment onto a blank folio with her cipher marks reversed so that an outside reader might decipher the pattern but not the full text. Thomas would bring the fragment to a contact in the market who owed him a favor, someone who could copy the stitchwork of the family tree. They allotted times, hiding places, and signals. They practiced the short lines they would use. Their decisions were pragmatic, not poetic. Move at dusk, leave a token at the eastern gate, meet under the smith's awning. The chapter pressed on action. Every plan was a response to evidence and risk. Halfway through the cataloguing, Miriam paused. She found a marginal notation she had missed earlier. A cross, reference to a parish register entry from 20 years prior, a baptism recorded under a false guardian. The twist shifted understanding. Someone had moved a child under another household's care and then erased the public record. That revelation changed their strategy. If the heir had been relocated decades ago under another name, the living bloodline could be a neighbor, a tradesman, or even someone Thomas had seen at the tavern. They realized the ledger's claim did not merely name a blood relative. It described a system of relocation and secrecy. The new information reframed the danger and broadened the circle of potential victims. They argued over the implication. So the heir could be anyone. Thomas, every syllable sharp. Anyone who was moved, Miriam replied. We cannot pick a name in the dark. The narrator recorded their exchange, then recorded the external event that followed. A single knock at the safe room door. Both of them froze. The knock came again, measured 3 short taps. Their plan pivoted instantly from cataloguing to concealment. Miriam slid the folio into the codex and closed the cover with an audible snap. Thomas jammed the fragment into his pocket. The knock sounded a third time, closer now. They exchanged looks. Their emotions tightened into fear. Miriam moved to the door and opened it a crack. A figure stood in the rain, an unnamed retainer, breath steaming, eyes flicking to the inside. He carried no candle, nothing at first. He handed over a small scrap of paper folded in half and stepped back into the night. Thomas took the scrap, unfolded it with fingers that did not stop trembling. The scrap read, "Do not trust the ledger alone. There are names hidden under name. Check the forged ledger." They absorbed the scrap in silence. It was a small delivery, but it changed the course again. Suspicion mutated into a brittle hope that someone outside still watched and still aided them. They had a new lead. The forged ledger. Thomas recognized the smith in the village who kept a book of apprentices and deliveries. Miriam counted the risk. "We go to the forge tonight," she said. "We move with care and bring only what we must." Thomas nodded. "Miriam." "If they find out Ivy run," he started and then stopped, unable to finish the sentence. She put a hand on his sleeve, steadying him by action. "We will not let them take the hair or use the binding tonight," she said. They set the fragment in a hidden pocket and left the safe room at noon, walking through rain, damp alleys to the smith's yard. The narrator followed with direct observation. The smith's ledger sat under a heavy stone in the corner of the workhouse. The page bore soot and a thumbprint in iron dust. Miriam opened it and found an entry, an apprenticeship recorded under a different surname that matched a cross, stitched mark in the manor ledger. The evidence moved from paper to a public place. It tied the manor's private ledger to a public, if obscured, trace. As dusk approached, they prepared to present their findings to a trusted magistrate. They practiced short lines of testimony and measured what they would and would not show. Miriam folded the folio into her codex and placed a small wax seal on the outer leaf, an act that made the secret both heavier and less likely to spill by accident. Thomas swallowed and wiped his palms on his coat. Their plan held consequence. They would expose a claim that had been kept in private ledgers, and in doing so they risked forcing Alastair to act sooner. That night, in the safe room, Miriam catalogued once more and then slid the single, most damning folio into Thomas' hand. She met his eye. "If they come for you," she said, "do not speak their names in the hall." He nodded. He did not ask who the heir was. He only held the paper like a flint, something to strike against reality. The chapter closed with a small, concrete beat. The codex closed, the candle guttered to a stub, and a knock sounded at the outer door. It was close enough that both of them heard the pause of a boot on the stair. They moved as one. Miriam pushed the codex into a hidden cavity beneath the floorboard, and Thomas slid the folded fragment into the lining of his coat. The knock came again, slower. Miriam pressed her ear to the door and heard a voice call a single name, her name, spoken by someone who knew it well. She did not answer. The final sound was the latch turning not quite open, and the chapter ended on that precise, situational note. Thomas slammed into the manor antechamber and sent a brass candlestick skittering across the flagstones. "They will bind him tonight," he barked, and the words hit the gathered faces like a thrown stone. Suspicion tightened Miriam's fingers around the cloth-bound codex at her belt. She had been cataloguing marginalia an hour before and had not expected confrontation. Alastair Crow rose from the shadowed bench without surprise, his bronze pendant catching the candlelight. The immediate problem was clear and concrete. The society had scheduled a rite to attach a claimed celestial descent to a living child, and the pamphlet Thomas carried named the date and place. The chamber smelled of cold wax and old ink. Residents of the manor moved to confront the night. Sister Miriam stood with the codex pressed to her hip, making no effort to hide the ink on her fingertips. Her role as chronicler had put her in the middle of the group's ledger and the chest of Lineage. That ledger, chained to Alastair's belt, had been opened in the scriptorium a fortnight earlier. Miriam's suspicion had been deliberate for days. Marginal cipher marks, a stitched family tree, a date circled in red. She refused to call it fear yet. Suspicion was the tool that made her examine seams. She folded her hands, smoothed paper against paper, and set the codex on a low stone table where Thomas's packet lay spread in a wet fan. "Thomas, Miriam." And her voice was level. "Show me." Thomas dropped the torn pamphlet onto the table. The pamphlet's edges were damp and smeared with dirt. A hand had ripped it roughly from a bound folio. "It names the boy, Thomas." Keeping his eyes away from Alastair, "It names the place." He jabbed a thumb at the pamphlet, and the sentence was its own small accusation. Alastair's face did not redden. He only folded his hands and waited, the ledger's chain clinking like a small bell. Miriam opened the pamphlet. A crude map of the manor Sundercroft marked a circle in black ink. The torn margin bore a sequence of stitched names, surnames, and dates, annotated in the ledger's cipher. Her eyes traced a line from the circle to a single phrase in a different hand. "Preserve the line by bond." The discovery forced movement in the room. Thomas stepped closer. Alastair's jaw clenched. Miriam's hands trembled a fraction as she smoothed the paper. This was not theory anymore. It was a deadline. They moved toward the scriptorium because the chained ledger was the only object in the house that could prove intent. The corridor smelled of rain and rotting wood from an earlier storm. Someone had set a pail to catch a leak near the scriptorium door. Miriam kept the pamphlet between her fingers as if it were a religious object or a wound. The doorway, Thomas hesitated and gave her an urgent look. "Sister Miriam," he said, "we can let this happen. We have to cut the name out, burn it, anything." He pushed a wet lock of hair from his forehead. His urgency carried brittle regret. Miriam's suspicion shifted inward, probing her own role. She remembered the ledger as brass clasp, and the way Alastair tapped his ring when measuring truth. If the ledger named a child, the covenant had moved from doctrine to action. In the scriptorium, the chained ledger lay on the stone table beneath a low lamp. The lamp's oil scent pinched Miriam's nose. She set the pamphlet beside the ledger and produced a small bone needle for working bindings. Her fingers had used one for decades. Thomas and Miriam worked together to unfasten the chain without tearing the ledger's leather. Each clink of the chain sounded like a new accusation. They opened the ledger at the index Alastair had never let anyone touch. The pages were dense with names, stamped sigils, and stitch marks where family branches were held together by crimson thread. Miriam's eyes mapped the genealogy the way she would map marginal notes, line to line, stitch to stitch. Her fingers found a date written in a different ink and a name threaded through the family tree. It matched the pamphlet. The ledger named the intended participant and a line of instruction. Ritual binding at midnight, performed by the chronicler in the presence of the patriarch. They'll use the stitches, Thomas, voice close to a rasp. They think the names themselves hold the tie. He jabbed his finger at the sewn line. Miriam's suspicion hardened into anger. She had catalogued these stitches as a record, not as a mechanism for binding flesh to claim. Her hands lifted to the sewn margin. She felt the grain of the paper, the tension of thread under her thumbnail. Alistair entered the scriptorium not by the main door, but by a side corridor that left him half in shadow. He moved with the slow certainty of someone who expected to be opposed. "You should not have come here," he said without raising his voice. "This is wrong, Alistair." Miriam replied, "You planned to use the ledger as a tool, not a chronicle, Miriam." Alistair cut her off. "It preserves us. It keeps the line from being dissolved by marriage, by death, by the parish. We do not murder. We secure continuity." The word continuity landed like a ledger on a table, objective, meant to mask intent. Miriam's doubt flickered. She searched for compromise in his posture, and found only the weight of duty. Thomas stepped forward. "Alistair, you said you would never harm a child," he the name. "Alistair, you promised." The promise echoed against the stone. Alistair tapped his ring and tilted his head. "Promises change," he said. "We have always stood on the edge, Thomas. We stand to hold what heaven mislaid." A small, ugly smile tightened his mouth. The argument became a tight back and forth. "Alistair, this is binding a living boy to your claim." Thomas shot. "It is not preservation. We do not bind blood to paper." "Thomas," Alistair replied, "we call the line and the line answers. You will not call by force. Miriam, you need me to read it. Alistair, you need my voice. You are asking me to betray the codex." Her heartbeat pushed at her ribs. The ledger lay between them like evidence and altar both. The room held its breath. "Miriam," Alistair softly, "the ledger names you too. You are part of our lineage. Do you deny what your blood has been told?" He used her name as a lever. Miriam felt betrayal like a temperature change against her skin. She had come to the ledger to protect record, not to become its instrument. A different suspicion took root. Doubt about the neutrality of her chronicling. She thought of the chest they had opened in the scriptorium earlier, where Thomas had piled the star charts and the stitched family tree. She remembered the smear of blood across the ragged page in chapter 3. That image flickered now. The ledger was no longer only a book. She moved then, not in words but in action. Miriam slid a blade under the crimson thread where a secondary name was sewn. The action was precise. She had done less and worse in restorations. Her blade nicked the thread and left a white hair of cotton in the air. "Stop, Alistair," and his hand went to the ledger. He did not strike, but he stepped between her hand and the pages. Thomas lunged for the chain to pry it loose. The three of them folded into a tangle of limbs, books, and shouting. Pages fanned and a wax seal cracked. The scrap of wax fell and exposed a concealed sigil pressed beneath it on the ledger's cover. The sigil was a fractured angel, a jagged star crossed by a stitched line. The sudden reveal was a small, bright violence, a symbol that turned argument into ritual. Thomas grabbed the ledger and thrust it toward Miriam. "Tear it out," he hissed. "Tear her name out." Miriam's fingers found the sewn family tree and paused. The ledger resisted. The binding pulled threads like muscle. The room's noise reduced to the sound of cloth ripping and Alistair's breath. Miriam felt another shift of feeling. Guilt leaked from the ledger into her bones. She had sworn to record truth, to protect the names, to preserve the text. Now she realized that preserving the text here preserved an action. She remembered the crimson ledger in chapter 1, the low chant, the way a candle, lit circle had been laid out like a work surface. Her chronicler's hands had always been meant to record, not to execute. The ledger had tricked her neutrality into participation. Alistair's voice lost some of its diplomacy. "Miriam," he said, "you do not resist the task with conviction. You sue, you bind. This is your work." His eyes were fixed on her hands. The words sounded like accusation and instruction at the same time. Miriam felt something fracture inside her, loyalty to the society, duty to the ledger, and a new fierce refusal. No, Miriam, and the single syllable cut clean. I will not become your instrument. She seized the bone needle and drove it through the crimson thread by the ledger's margin, not to mend but to sever. Thomas, seeing the movement, lunged again and ripped at the stitched names. The three of them pitched into a scramble. The scriptorium lamp rocked and guttered, sending the room into a thinner light and crisp shadows. The scramble tore seals and loosened a folded sheet, an old pitch of parchment with star maps and a small. Soon name list slipped free and fluttered like a bird from the ledger. Miriam scooped it up and read, and the letters stepped out as accusation. Her own name written and bound into the lineage with a tiny cross beside it. Her heart stuttered. She tasted metal. This was the moment their earlier discovery in the chest of starry lineage connected to the present. The Soon family tree had placed her, the chronicler, inside the rite itself. The revelation changed who could be considered neutral. She now held proof that the chronicler's role was central to the covenant. Miriam's suspicion ruptured into a new emotion, betrayal. She pressed the parchment to her chest and let her breath come sharp. Alistair, she said. And she said his name often so that every ear knew who answered. Why is my name Soon in? Alistair's face closed. Because you record continuity, he said. Because the chronicler binds memory to the line. You understood this, Miriam? His voice tried to steady matters by returning to theory. Thomas made a sound that was half laugh and half sob. In the forced quiet that followed, a different sound rose from the corridor. The manor's old clock chimed 11. Someone had whispered under breath about midnight. The outer world reminded them of the hour, and the moment widened into urgency. Thomas slammed the scriptorium door and looked to Miriam. We must keep it from happening tonight, he said. We must. He did not finish. Miriam unrolled the parchment again as if the letters might alter themselves. Her fingers traced the tiny cross. The Soon name made her the instrument or the obstacle. They plotted quickly and with blunt instruments. Thomas suggested burning the page and scattering ash in the yard. Alistair argued for concealment, hide the ledger and argue its absence in the circle. Miriam insisted on a third option. Alter the ledger so the rite, if attempted, would collapse into contradiction. Change the stitch, she said. If the binding requires precise names, we can make it unreadable. Her plan required time and her voice to recite certain incantatory sequences in the ledger, exact sequences she knew by rote. Alistair's eyes narrowed. You would mock the rite with false reading. He asked. You would lie with scripture. Miriam answered with action rather than speech. She began to unpick names and replace them with indecipherable glyphs only she knew how to bind. They worked with hurried precision. Alistair watched and kept a distance, as if waiting for a change of heart. Thomas moved from table to shelf, collecting candles and a length of black cloth. Every 3 minutes the manor offered interruptions. Footsteps above, a cough through the wall, the kettle in another wing beginning to whistle. Each interruption shifted the plan and tightened their options. Miriam unthreaded the name and restitched a cipher in its place, her needle moving 2 stitches to the left, then 1 to the right, then skipping a pattern known to her alone. The ledger's paper resisted, but she had conserved old inks and new code. She could make a name read as a question instead of a claim. At the margin, Miriam found another Soon slip, this one different in hand and in thread. Her eyes widened. It was a later edition, stitched with a thinner red and an added notation that explained procedure for calling. The marginal hand was Alistair's. The notation described not only names but the chronicler's vocal cadence. The ledger did not merely record genealogy. It prescribed performance. Miriam read aloud the short notation under breath to test how it sounded. Thomas listened with a hard look and pressed his palm to his mouth. If you read it, he said quietly, it will work. If you refuse, it risks collapse. Miriam felt the second shift of emotion. Fear rose now as a physical thing, fingers cooling, stomach tightening, because refusal might not stop Alistair from acting without her. Her body prepared for movement. Despite the danger, Miriam made one more discovery. Between the ledgers in papers, she found a folded fragment from the chest of starry Lineage. A faded family tree with her own marginal notes in her hand, written years ago while she catalogued a different folio. She had annotated a date on the page, then an observation about the stitch pattern. Seeing her handwriting there, young, quick, and precise, brought a small, sharp shame. She had been complicit by carelessness once. Now the ledger weaponized that earlier habit. Her name in her own hand showed that at some point she had been permitted or enlisted to trace bonds. The twist changed everything. The chronicler's neutrality had been a cultivated attribute, shaped by the elders who needed her to write what they later needed to perform. The plan to alter the ledger came apart as the manor's bell tolled midnight. Noise rose from the corridor, Alistair's voice calling the elders, boots on stone, the slow scrape of cloaks. The three of them moved to the manor Santacamba, where candles had been arranged into a circle earlier that evening. The ritual was already half prepared. Chairs left pushed back, ash in the brazier. A dark opener became a march toward full confrontation. Alistair reached the antechamber first and positioned himself before the circle. He placed the ledger on a low altar and tapped his ring twice, as if marking the beat. "You cannot deny the lineage," he said to the empty chairs. "We will not be dissolved by the parish. We will answer heaven's call." Miriam stepped forward and turned the ledger to face her. "Listen, Alistair," she said. And she said his name again to ensure the act of address carried weight. "If you force this, you will bind more than a name. You will bind us to a theft. I will not read what makes a child a thing." Her hands were steady, though tremors under skin betrayed the pressure. The elders filed in, two others from the society, faces hooded, voices low. Thomas stood close by Miriam, eyes wide and fixed. The room's atmosphere narrowed to the ledger, the Soon family tree, and the small sheet with Miriam's name. Alistair lifted the ledger as if to hand it to someone else. Instead he set it before Miriam. "Read," he said, "or we perform without you." The threat was explicit. Thomas' mouth opened. He began a rapid string of words. "Alistair, you cannot," and Alistair cut him with a look that made Thomas shut up. Miriam felt the stakes compressed to a single line. Read and help, refuse and risk their wrath, or refuse and force Alistair to find another method. She measured the group's faces. The elders' hands were clenched. The boy named in the pamphlet would arrive any moment if Alistair's plan required a recruited household. The clock's last chime sounded when Miriam spoke, and her voice fell into the ledger's prescribed cadence. She meant to substitute, to make the words collapse. She had altered ink, replaced names with cipher, and practiced a false rhythm. What she did not anticipate was the ledger's response. As she read, the candle flames flared once and a low vibration filled the room. The thick air seemed to carry a chord that landed in the chest of every speaker. Thomas tried to lunge, to seize her throat or the ledger, but Alistair's elder moved with a blade quick as a thought and pinned him to the doorway. Miriam stammered through the altered passages. The letters she had soon shifted in sound to something else. The ritual did not fail, it bent. The Soon cipher called and the ledger answered with a brief, violent manifestation. A pressure in the room, the smell of cold metal, and a small luminous shape that coalesced above the altar like a tear in the air. The shape answered the ledger's call by taking on a face that resembled no human anatomy and then, with a flash, a fragmentary echo of an angelic form. The manifestation was brief, and its answer was not what Alistair had promised. It neither spoke nor obeyed. It grazed the room with a presence and then collapsed into a smear of scorched paper and a faint, invisible burn on Miriam's hands. The ledger lay altered now, ink darkened into a new pattern, and a mark scorched through the margin where her name had been. Thomas fell to his knees, clutching a wound along his forearm where a small ember had grazed him. The elders stood as if struck. Alistair's jaw worked. Silence pressed after the event, heavy and dense. The immediate results were material. A burned mark on Miriam's palms that would not wash away, a smear of ash in the ledger forming a new sigil, and a small, fresh tear in one of the elders' cloaks, as if something had brushed him. Thomas pressed his hand to his arm and breathed sharply, tasting iron. Miriam felt the ledger pulse in the same rhythm as her pulse and realized that the covenant had been answered, not by a blessing but by a worn, ambiguous echo. Whatever they had called had kept the claim but left consequences that none of them had planned. In the ruined antechamber that followed, alliances shifted under the pressure of proof. Thomas tended to his wound and threatened to leave if no reparations were made. Alistair insisted the covenant had been preserved. He repeated the word as though it still contained comfort. Miriam wrapped her burned hands in cloth and checked the ledger. Where her name had been a clean stitch, there now sat a blackened hollow rimmed in new ink. She did not feel triumphant. She felt the ledger's demands, a chronicler marked, a society altered. Thomas spoke in clipped bursts. "We did not need to touch the boy," he said. "We did not need to ask him to answer a lineage." He looked at Alistair. "Why did you risk this?" Alistair answered with the metallic steadiness of someone who must hold an explanation as a bulwark. "We keep ourselves from being erased." The line answers so we might continue our work. His voice had the cadence of an argument that would not be surrendered. Miriam watched both men, measuring how their choices pushed hers. Miriam made a decision that accelerated the chapter's final movement. She slid the ledger into the chest of starry Lineage, folding the altered genealogy over her own marginal notes, and then she stitched the chest's lining with a slow, deliberate knot. Her actions were quiet and specific. She wrapped the scorched leaf in waxed cloth, tied a second cord around it, and then sealed the chest with her iron bracelet, cipher pressed into the wax. She did this not to hide evidence, but to control how it was revealed. Putting the ledger back into the chest was an act of custody rather than concealment. When she closed the chest and took the key from Alistair's hand, his face flared. "You will not lock this away," he said. "This must stand before the circle." Miriam met his eyes with calm that came from a long apprenticeship with ink and record. "I will keep it," she said, "and I will only bring it forth when the ledger is read with truth, not command. If you insist on forcing a child," she lifted her voice and finished the sentence with action, "then I will refuse to be the chronicler of that act. I will not inscribe lies into the line." Her refusal was both moral and procedural, spoken with the plainness of registry. Thomas stepped to her side. "Miriam," he said, "come with me. Leave this place. If you stay, they will demand your voice again." Miriam looked at Thomas, and then at Alistair. The wound in Thomas' arm bled slowly into the clay of the scriptorium floor. He had already decided to atone or to flee. His body had chosen either flight or penance. She felt the second shift of emotions close into a new equilibrium. Betrayal had spurred defiance, and then a stubborn calm. She made one more choice. She would not let the ledger be used to snare the boy, but she would not destroy the record entirely. Instead, she tucked the altered genealogy into a hidden compartment inside the chest and removed the family tree with a pattern that required a different reading, one that only she could perform correctly. Then she wrapped the chest and set it where the manor's threshold could not be reached without leaving footprinted evidence. By doing so, she did not free the society from its claims, but she complicated it. Before she left the antechamber, Miriam addressed Alistair once more. "You have preserved what you called continuity," she said, "but continuity means consequence too. The mark on the ledger will not wash clean. You have bound us to the answer that returned tonight." Alistair's face tightened, as if he could not admit a new variable into the old logic. He reached for a defense and found only the record of his own hand in the margin. He swallowed. Thumb has lowered his head. Go, he said to Miriam. Go and do not let them drag you back in. He did not say where he would go. Miriam took the folded parchment with her name one last time. She smoothed it and then tucked it into her inner pocket. The burn on her palm had not faded. It hummed like a live wire beneath cloth. She did not speak of future chapters. She walked toward the manor threshold, where the night had thinned to a dawn haze. At the threshold she paused and turned once to look into the manor. Alastair stood in the doorway of the scriptorium, the ledger's chain at his belt. The elders congregated behind him, faces drawn. The brazier had cooled, candles burned low. Miriam stepped out into the yard where rain had left the paving slick. She closed the heavy door behind her and set the key into her palm. The act was small and precise. A knot in thread, a turn of iron, a closing of a ledger. She moved into the wet dawn with Thomas following for a span, then slipping away down the lane toward a place he said he could hide or repair his conscience. Miriam walked alone past the manor's gate and set the chest's secret resting place in her mind like a map. She had not healed anything outright. The Covenant's claim had not been undone, but the ledger had been altered, and she had exchanged neutrality for custody. The narrator documents the final state in concrete terms. The ledger sits sealed within the chest, a new cipher threaded into its margins, a scorched mark across the page where Miriam's name had been called and answered. Thomas left with a wound and the intention to atone. Alastair remained, insisting the Covenant persisted while bearing the uncertainty of what they had actually summoned. Miriam carries the burn on her hands and the responsibility of a chronicler who can refuse performance. The manor continues to exist as a scarred site of answered claims and contested record. In the pre-dawn light, Miriam made a choice that would shape the society's future. She would keep the altered genealogy and bring it forward only when truth, and not coercion, required the ledger's voice. She wound crimson thread about the chest's clasp and tied it with one deliberate knot. The knot sealed not myth but decision. Then she turned her back on the manor's porch and walked away. The chest carried as custody and burden both. The manor's threshold swallowed her shadow as she left, and the wind lifted a loose lock of her braid, carrying it toward the road. The last sound before she vanished into the mist was the manor door closing with a slow, final sigh.